The moment I saw Vanessa Brooks walking through my mother-in-law's front door wearing scrubs and carrying a certified nursing assistant badge, my coffee cup slipped from my hands and shattered against the hardwood floor. The woman who had been sleeping with my husband for 8 months was now legally authorized to care for the most vulnerable member of our family, and judging by the triumphant smile she flashed me, this was no coincidence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Caroline Walsh, and 3 weeks ago, I believed I had everything figured out. I thought I knew my husband Derek well enough after 12 years of marriage to predict his moods, his habits, even his lies. I thought I understood the careful balance we'd struck in caring for his 78-year-old mother Maggie, who lived in the beautiful assisted living community in Lake Oswego, just 20 minutes from our Laurelhurst home in Portland. Most importantly, I thought I had successfully compartmentalized the knowledge of Derek's affair, choosing to gather evidence slowly while planning my exit strategy with the methodical precision that had made me successful as a nonprofit financial auditor. What I hadn't anticipated was how much deeper this betrayal would go, or how it would threaten the safety of someone I'd grown to love as my own mother. The Tuesday morning that changed everything started like any other in our carefully choreographed routine. Derek left early for Northwest Financial Consulting Group, where he managed investment portfolios for Portland's tech executives and their families. I prepared for another day reviewing grant expenditures for the Oregon Environmental Justice Coalition, work that had trained me to spot financial irregularities and follow money trails that others might miss. Our Victorian house on Sandy Boulevard hummed with the ordinary sounds of suburban life. The coffee maker gurgling, the morning news droning from the kitchen television, neither of us speaking more than necessary. For the past 8 months, ever since I discovered Derek's affair with Vanessa Brooks, we'd been living like polite strangers sharing a mortgage. I'd found out about their relationship the way most wives do, through a combination of suspicious phone behavior and credit card statements that didn't match his supposed whereabouts. Vanessa was 29, blonde, and worked at the upscale fitness center, where Derek had started spending an unusual amount of time claiming to focus on his cardiovascular health. The irony wasn't lost on me that his heart was indeed involved, just not in the way he'd suggested. Rather than confronting him immediately, I'd chosen a different path. My work auditing financial records had taught me the value of patience and thorough documentation. I opened my own bank account, began photographing relevant documents, and started building a case for divorce that would protect my interests and ensure Derek couldn't hide assets during proceedings. It was a long-term strategy that required me to continue playing the role of the unsuspecting wife while methodically preparing for my eventual departure. The plan was working perfectly until I walked into Maggie's apartment that Tuesday morning and found it had been invaded by the enemy. Maggie Walsh was not your typical elderly resident of an assisted living facility. At 78, she remained sharp, independent, and fiercely protective of her privacy. She'd moved to Sunset Manor 2 years earlier after a minor fall convinced Derek she needed additional support, but she'd insisted on maintaining her own apartment rather than requiring full-time care. Her monthly fees were substantial, nearly $4,000. But Maggie had been careful with money throughout her life and had sufficient retirement savings to maintain her independence for years to come. She also had what Derek often referred to as old Portland money, meaning she owned property that had appreciated dramatically over the decades. Her small craftsman house in the Irvington neighborhood had been paid off for 20 years and was now worth nearly $800,000. Combined with her retirement accounts and Social Security, Maggie was what financial planners would call asset-rich, making her an attractive target for anyone seeking to exploit an elderly person. I'd grown genuinely fond of Maggie during the years Derek and I had been married. She had a wicked sense of humor, strong opinions about everything from Portland politics to the proper way to make Marionberry pie, and an impressive collection of books about Pacific Northwest history. Our relationship had deepened, especially over the past year, as Derek became increasingly distant and distracted. Maggie seemed to sense something was troubling me, though she was too polite to pry directly. Instead, she'd invite me for longer visits, suggest we take walks through the facility's gardens, and share stories about her own marriage that somehow conveyed both wisdom and warning. That Tuesday morning, I'd planned to spend an hour with Maggie before heading to the office. We'd established a routine of coffee and conversation twice a week, time I'd begun to treasure as my marriage deteriorated. I'd used my key to enter her apartment, expecting to find her reading the Oregonian at her small dining table as usual. Instead, I discovered Vanessa Brooks efficiently reorganizing Maggie's medication cabinet, while my mother-in-law sat in her armchair, looking confused and slightly distressed. The shock of seeing Derek's mistress in this context was so profound that I literally couldn't speak for several seconds. Vanessa, however, seemed perfectly at ease with the situation. She turned to greet me with the kind of professional smile I'd seen her use at the fitness center, as if we were casual acquaintances rather than women whose lives had become intimately connected through her relationship with my husband. "Oh, Caroline, how wonderful that you're here," she said, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. "I was just getting oriented with Mrs. Walsh's care routine. Derek mentioned you usually visit on Tuesdays, so I made sure to schedule my first shift accordingly." The word shift hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a social visit or even an inappropriate intrusion. Vanessa was here in a professional capacity, wearing scrubs that bore the logo of a home healthcare agency I'd never heard of. The identification badge clipped to her shirt pocket clearly displayed her photograph, name, and certification as a nursing assistant, along with the official seal that indicated she'd completed the required training and background checks. Maggie looked up at me with relief evident in her eyes. "Caroline, dear, I'm so glad you're here. There seems to be some confusion about my care arrangements. This young woman says Derek hired her to help me with daily activities, but I don't recall agreeing to any such thing." My mind raced as I tried to process the implications of what I was witnessing. Derek had arranged for his mistress to become his mother's caregiver without consulting either Maggie or me. The level of audacity required for such a move was staggering, but even more disturbing were the potential motivations behind it. As someone who regularly reviewed financial records for signs of fraud and mismanagement, I immediately recognized this scenario as a classic setup for elder financial abuse. Vanessa continued her performance, addressing Maggie with the kind of patronizing sweetness that healthcare workers sometimes use with elderly patients. "Now, Mrs. Walsh, Derek explained that you've been having some memory concerns lately. He's worried about you managing your medications and finances on your own. That's why he arranged for me to provide some additional support." This was a lie, and I knew it because I'd been spending significant time with Maggie and had observed no cognitive decline whatsoever. If anything, she seemed sharper than many people half her age. The suggestion that she needed help managing her affairs was not only false, but potentially dangerous if it was being used to justify giving Vanessa access to Maggie's personal information and resources. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said carefully, my voice steady despite the chaos in my thoughts. "Maggie, have you signed any paperwork authorizing additional care services?" Maggie shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not. I've been quite clear with Derek that I'm managing perfectly well on my own. This is the first I'm hearing about any of this." Vanessa's smile became slightly strained, but she maintained her professional demeanor. Sometimes families need to make difficult decisions about care, even when the patient isn't initially receptive to the idea. Derek has legal authority to make healthcare decisions for his mother if he believes she's not capable of making them herself. This statement sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Derek did not have legal authority to make healthcare decisions for his mother unless Maggie had been declared incompetent by a medical professional, which she definitely had not been. The fact that Vanessa was claiming otherwise suggested either a fundamental misunderstanding of elder care law or a deliberate attempt to mislead Maggie about her rights. I spent the next 30 minutes in Maggie's apartment, ostensibly making small talk while actually observing Vanessa's behavior and trying to understand the scope of what was happening. Vanessa seemed remarkably well-informed about Maggie's financial situation, mentioning specific details about her bank accounts and monthly expenses that would not normally be shared with a newly hired caregiver. She also made several references to helping Maggie, quote, organize her paperwork and streamline her financial management, phrases that made my auditor instincts scream with warning. When I finally left Maggie's apartment, promising to return the next day, my mind was spinning with questions and concerns. How had Vanessa obtained certification as a nursing assistant so quickly? When I discovered the affair 8 months earlier, she'd been working at the fitness center with no apparent medical training. The process of becoming a certified nursing assistant typically required several weeks of coursework and clinical training, plus background checks and state certification. The timeline suggested she'd been planning this move for months. More troubling was the question of how Derek had arranged for Vanessa to be assigned as Maggie's caregiver. Assisted living facilities like Sunset Manor typically worked with established healthcare agencies that provided vetted and bonded caregivers. The idea that Derek could simply request a specific individual seemed highly irregular, unless there were financial incentives or personal relationships involved that I didn't know about. That evening, I waited until Derek had retreated to his home office before beginning my preliminary research. Using the laptop I kept for personal financial management, I started investigating the healthcare agency whose logo I'd seen on Vanessa's scrubs. Pacific Northwest Home Care Services had been established just 4 months earlier, according to state business registration records.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The listed owner was someone named Marcus Reed, a name I didn't recognize, but the business address was a P.O. box rather than a physical location. Further digging revealed that Pacific Northwest Home Care Services had obtained the necessary state licenses and insurance required to provide in-home care services. But the company had no online presence, no website, and no reviews from clients or families. For a healthcare agency serving Portland's elderly population, this lack of digital footprint was highly unusual. Most legitimate agencies invested heavily in online marketing and reputation management to attract clients and their families. I spent hours that night researching elder financial abuse patterns and legal protections for vulnerable adults. What I learned made my blood run cold. Financial exploitation of the elderly was one of the fastest-growing crimes in the country, with family members and trusted caregivers being the most common perpetrators. The pattern typically involved gaining access to the victim's home and personal information, then gradually taking control of their finances through a combination of manipulation, isolation, and legal maneuvering. The fact that Vanessa now had legitimate access to Maggie's apartment and personal information put her in a perfect position to execute this type of fraud. As a certified caregiver, she could justify her presence in Maggie's home and her knowledge of personal details that would otherwise seem suspicious. If she and Derek were working together, they could potentially access Maggie's bank accounts, change beneficiary information, or even pressure her into signing documents that would transfer assets. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. Instead of going to the office, I drove directly to Sunset Manor and spent the day observing the facility's operations and talking with staff members about their policies regarding outside caregivers. What I learned confirmed my worst fears. The facility's administrator, a competent woman named Helen Bradshaw, explained that residents were allowed to hire private caregivers to supplement the services provided by the facility, but such arrangements were supposed to be coordinated through the resident's family and documented with the facility's care coordination team. In Maggie's case, no such documentation existed. Derek had apparently arranged for Vanessa's services without informing the facility administration, which violated both facility policies and state regulations governing care coordination. More disturbing was Helen's revelation that Derek had recently inquired about Maggie's, quote, cognitive status, and whether the facility had noticed any decline in her mental abilities. These inquiries had puzzled the staff because Maggie was one of their most independent and cognitively intact residents. The timing of Derek's questions, combined with Vanessa's claims about Maggie's supposed memory issues, suggested a coordinated effort to establish a narrative of cognitive decline that could justify taking control of her affairs. That afternoon, I made an appointment with Dr. Patricia Reeves, Maggie's longtime physician, under the pretense of discussing family health history. Dr. Reeves confirmed that Maggie had no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment, and that her most recent cognitive assessment had been completely normal. When I mentioned Derek's concerns about his mother's mental status, Dr. Reeves seemed surprised and slightly concerned. "Derek hasn't contacted me about any cognitive concerns," she said, reviewing Maggie's chart. If he had questions about his mother's mental status, the appropriate step would be to schedule an evaluation. The fact that he's making these claims without seeking professional assessment is troubling. Dr. Reeves also provided crucial information about the legal requirements for assuming healthcare decision-making authority for an elderly family member. In Oregon, adult children could not simply take control of their parents' medical or financial decisions without either explicit written authorization from the parent or a formal legal process involving medical evaluation and court approval. Derek's claims about having authority to make decisions for Maggie were not only false but potentially fraudulent. By the end of that week, I had assembled enough information to confirm my worst suspicions. Derek and Vanessa were executing a sophisticated scheme to gain control of Maggie's assets by positioning Vanessa as a trusted caregiver, while simultaneously undermining Maggie's reputation for independence and cognitive competence. The plan was both clever and cruel, exploiting the natural concerns adult children have about aging parents, while taking advantage of Maggie's trusting nature and social isolation. The question now was what to do with this information. Confronting Derek directly would likely result in him escalating the timeline or finding ways to hide evidence of the scheme. Going to the police might be premature since no actual theft had occurred yet, and financial crimes involving family members were notoriously difficult to prosecute. What I needed was a way to document the scheme while protecting Maggie from immediate harm. That's when I decided to launch my own investigation, using the same methodical approach that had made me successful in my professional auditing work. I would gather evidence, document every interaction, and build a case that would not only stop Derek and Vanessa, but ensure they faced appropriate consequences for targeting a vulnerable elderly woman. The irony wasn't lost on me that my husband's betrayal had prepared me perfectly for this moment. The months I'd spent quietly documenting his affair had taught me how to gather evidence without arousing suspicion, how to maintain a facade of normalcy while pursuing a hidden agenda, and how to think strategically about long-term outcomes rather than immediate emotional satisfaction. What Derek and Vanessa didn't know was that they'd chosen the wrong family to target. They'd assumed that a wife dealing with infidelity would be too distracted and emotionally compromised to notice financial fraud happening right under her nose. They'd underestimated both my professional skills and my genuine affection for Maggie. As I sat in my car outside Sunset Manor that Friday evening, watching Vanessa leave Maggie's apartment after another care session, I felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over me. For months, I'd been the victim in this story, the wronged wife gathering evidence for an inevitable divorce. Now I had the opportunity to become something else entirely, the protector of someone who couldn't protect herself, the investigator who would expose a crime before it could fully unfold, and the advocate who would ensure that justice was served. The investigation I was about to launch would test every skill I'd developed in my career, and every ounce of strength I'd gained from surviving Derek's betrayal. It would require me to be smarter, more patient, and more strategic than I'd ever been before. But as I thought about Maggie's confused expression when Vanessa had reorganized her medication cabinet without permission, I knew I had no choice. This was no longer just about my marriage or my future. This was about protecting someone I loved from people who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. And I was going to make sure that opportunity became their downfall. My transformation from grieving wife to undercover investigator began at 5:30 on a Monday morning in my home office, surrounded by manila folders and a fresh pot of coffee that would be the first of many that day. I had taken a week of personal leave from the Oregon Environmental Justice Coalition, telling my supervisor I needed to handle some family medical issues. It wasn't entirely a lie, though the medical issue was more about preventing harm than treating existing illness. The first challenge was establishing a systematic approach to gathering evidence without alerting Derek or Vanessa to my activities. My experience auditing nonprofit organizations had taught me that financial crimes always leave paper trails, but those trails are often disguised as legitimate transactions or buried in routine paperwork that appears innocuous to casual observers. The key was knowing what to look for and having the patience to examine every detail. I started by creating what I privately called Operation Maggie, a comprehensive investigation plan that would allow me to document every aspect of Derek and Vanessa's scheme, while building a legal case that could withstand scrutiny from law enforcement and prosecutors. The plan had three main components: financial surveillance, behavioral documentation, and legal research. Each component required different skills and resources, but together they would create an unassailable record of elder abuse in progress. The financial surveillance began with Maggie's bank records. As Derek's wife, I had access to many of the family financial documents stored in our home office, including old tax returns that listed Maggie as a dependent and insurance paperwork that referenced her accounts. More importantly, Maggie had previously given me emergency access to her primary checking account in case something happened to Derek. She'd intended this as a safety measure, never imagining it would become a tool for protecting her from her own son. Using online banking access, I began monitoring Maggie's accounts for unusual activity. What I discovered in the first week of surveillance was more troubling than I'd expected. Small withdrawals had been occurring regularly for the past month, always in amounts just under $200, and always on days when Vanessa was scheduled to provide care. The withdrawals were being made using Maggie's debit card, but the timing and frequency suggested they weren't being initiated by Maggie herself. More concerning were several larger transactions that had occurred over the past 6 weeks. A payment of $1,500 had been made to Pacific Northwest Home Care Services, presumably for Vanessa's services, but the payment had been processed as an automatic withdrawal rather than a check written by Maggie. Another payment of $800 had gone to something called Elder Care Solutions, LLC, a company I couldn't find any record of in state business databases. The pattern of financial activity suggested that someone had gained access to Maggie's debit card and was using it to make both small, frequent withdrawals for personal expenses and larger payments to shell companies that were likely being used to launder stolen funds. The sophistication of the scheme indicated careful planning and knowledge of how to structure transactions to avoid triggering bank fraud detection systems. My next step was to establish surveillance of Vanessa's activities during her visits to Maggie's apartment. This required careful coordination and some creative problem-solving, since I couldn't simply lurk around Sunset Manor without attracting attention from staff or residents. Instead, I developed a schedule of spontaneous visits that would allow me to observe interactions while maintaining plausible reasons for being there. I also invested in some basic surveillance equipment, including a small digital recorder that could be concealed in my purse and a smartphone app that could record conversations remotely. These tools were legally questionable in some contexts, but Oregon's laws allowed recording of conversations as long as one party to the conversation consented, which meant I could legally record any interaction where I was present. The behavioral documentation component of my investigation focused on establishing a clear record of Maggie's actual cognitive and physical capabilities, which would contradict Derek and Vanessa's claims about her supposed decline. I arranged for Maggie to undergo a comprehensive geriatric assessment with Dr. Reeves, framing it as a routine health maintenance visit rather than a response to any specific concerns. The assessment results were exactly what I'd expected. Dr. Reeves found Maggie to be cognitively intact, physically capable of independent living, and showing no signs of the memory problems or confusion that Derek and Vanessa had been claiming. The doctor's written report would serve as crucial evidence that the justifications being used for increased care services were fabricated. I also began documenting my own observations of Maggie's daily functioning during my visits. I photographed her apartment to show that she kept it clean and organized, recorded her detailed discussions of current events to demonstrate her mental acuity, and noted her ability to manage complex tasks like balancing her checkbook and organizing her medications. This documentation would serve as a baseline against which any future claims of decline could be measured. The legal research component required me to understand both the criminal laws governing elder abuse and the civil procedures that could be used to protect Maggie's assets. I spent hours in the Multnomah County Law Library, researching cases involving financial exploitation of elderly victims, and studying the statutory definitions of crimes like theft, fraud, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. What I learned was both encouraging and frustrating. Oregon had strong laws protecting elderly victims of financial abuse, with penalties that included both criminal prosecution and civil remedies like asset recovery and punitive damages. However, these laws were often difficult to enforce because victims were frequently unwilling or unable to cooperate with investigations, and family members who committed financial abuse often had legal access to their victims' resources that made prosecution challenging. The key to building a successful case would be demonstrating that Maggie had not consented to the financial transactions and care arrangements being made on her behalf, and that Derek and Vanessa had used deception and manipulation to gain access to her resources. This would require careful documentation of their false claims about her cognitive status and evidence that they were taking money without her knowledge or permission. During my second week of investigation, I decided to take a more active approach to gathering evidence. I arranged to spend several days helping Maggie organize her personal papers, which would give me access to financial documents and correspondence that might reveal the full scope of the scheme. I also planned to be present during some of Vanessa's visits, which would allow me to observe their interactions and potentially record conversations that revealed their true intentions. The first opportunity came on a Wednesday morning when I arrived at Maggie's apartment just as Vanessa was beginning her shift. I brought a box of old family photographs that I claimed to be helping Maggie organize, which provided a legitimate reason for my presence and an activity that would keep us occupied while Vanessa went about her supposed care duties. What I observed during that 3-hour period was a masterclass in subtle psychological manipulation. Vanessa began by expressing concern about Maggie's quote, forgetfulness, citing supposed incidents that I knew had never occurred. She mentioned that Maggie had allegedly forgotten to take her medications the previous day, despite the fact that Maggie used a clearly organized pill dispenser that showed all medications had been taken properly. Vanessa then proceeded to help Maggie organize her financial paperwork, a process that involved asking detailed questions about account numbers, passwords, and beneficiary information. She framed these questions as necessary for coordinating care and ensuring that bills would be paid if Maggie became incapacitated. But the level of financial detail she was requesting went far beyond what a caregiver would need for legitimate purposes. Most disturbing was Vanessa's subtle pressure on Maggie to sign various documents that she claimed were routine care forms and insurance paperwork. When I examined these documents more closely, I realized that some of them were actually legal forms that would give Derek broader authority over Maggie's financial and medical decisions. The documents were written in complex legal language that would be difficult for most elderly people to understand, and Vanessa made no effort to explain their actual purpose or implications. I managed to photograph several of these documents while pretending to take pictures of the family photos we were organizing. The images clearly showed that Maggie was being asked to sign papers that would significantly compromise her independence and legal rights, all under the guise of routine administrative tasks. During my third week of investigation, I expanded my surveillance to include Derek's activities outside the home. I'd noticed that he'd been making more phone calls from his car and spending additional time at work, claiming he had new clients who required evening meetings. Using a GPS tracking app that I installed on our shared family tablet, which Derek often took with him for client presentations, I was able to monitor his movements and identify patterns that seemed suspicious. The tracking data revealed that Derek was making regular stops at a small office building in southeast Portland that housed several small businesses, including what appeared to be the actual location of Pacific Northwest Home Care Services. The company's business registration listed a P.O. box address, but Derek's visits to this building suggested that the company had a physical location that wasn't publicly disclosed. I drove by the building several times to observe its operations and discovered that it housed multiple small businesses that seemed to have very little actual activity. Most of the offices appeared empty, with minimal signage and no visible employees or customers. The building had the characteristics of what law enforcement calls a paper mill, a location used primarily to create the appearance of legitimate business operations, while actually serving as a front for fraudulent activities. On one of my surveillance visits, I observed Derek meeting with a man I didn't recognize in the parking lot of the building. Their conversation appeared intense and businesslike, with both men reviewing documents and exchanging what looked like cash or checks. I managed to photograph the meeting from a distance, and later used online reverse image searches to try to identify the unknown man. The photographs led me to discover that Derek's contact was Marcus Reed, the listed owner of Pacific Northwest Home Care Services. Further research revealed that Reed had a history of involvement with questionable business ventures, including 2 companies that had been dissolved following investigations by state regulatory agencies. His association with Derek suggested that the elder care scheme was part of a larger pattern of fraudulent business activities. By the end of my third week of investigation, I had assembled a substantial amount of evidence documenting the scope and sophistication of the scheme targeting Maggie. The financial records showed a clear pattern of unauthorized transactions. The behavioral observations contradicted claims about Maggie's supposed cognitive decline, and the surveillance data revealed connections between Derek and individuals with histories of fraudulent activities. However, I also realized that I was running out of time to gather evidence before the scheme progressed to more serious levels of financial exploitation. The documents Vanessa had been pressuring Maggie to sign would give Derek legal authority to make major financial decisions on her behalf, including the ability to sell her property and liquidate her retirement accounts. Once those documents were executed, stopping the fraud would become much more difficult, and the financial damage could be irreversible. I needed to accelerate my investigation and begin planning for the confrontation phase of my operation. This would require careful timing and strategic thinking about how to expose the scheme in a way that would maximize the chances of criminal prosecution, while protecting Maggie from retaliation or further exploitation. The key would be catching Derek and Vanessa in the act of committing fraud while having sufficient evidence to demonstrate their criminal intent and the systematic nature of their scheme. I'd learned from my professional experience that successful prosecutions of financial crimes required not just evidence of wrongdoing, but proof that the perpetrators had acted deliberately and with knowledge that their actions were illegal. My opportunity came when I discovered that Derek and Vanessa were planning to pressure Maggie into signing a power of attorney document during the following week. I'd overheard Derek making arrangements for this meeting during a phone call he thought I couldn't hear, and I realized that this would be the moment when their scheme transitioned from preparation to active fraud. The power of attorney document would give Derek complete control over Maggie's finances and property, allowing him to liquidate her assets and transfer money without her ongoing consent or knowledge. Once that document was signed, Maggie would be completely vulnerable to financial exploitation, and reversing the damage would require lengthy and expensive legal proceedings that might not be successful. I spent the weekend developing a plan to document the power of attorney meeting, while ensuring that I would have evidence of any pressure tactics or deceptive practices used to coerce Maggie's signature. The plan would require me to be present during the meeting without arousing suspicion, which meant I needed a legitimate reason to be at Maggie's apartment when Derek and Vanessa arrived with their legal documents. I decided to schedule a family meeting about Maggie's care needs, ostensibly in response to Derek's concerns about her supposed cognitive decline. I would frame the meeting as an opportunity for all of us to discuss Maggie's care preferences and ensure that everyone was on the same page about her needs and wishes. This would put me in the room when the power of attorney discussion occurred, while giving me a legitimate reason to ask questions and express concerns about any legal documents. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, giving me several days to prepare recording equipment and review the legal standards for proving fraud and undue influence in cases involving elderly victims. I also arranged for Dr. Reeves to be available by phone in case medical questions arose during the meeting, which would give me a professional ally who could contradict any false claims about Maggie's cognitive status. As I prepared for what I knew would be the crucial confrontation in my investigation, I reflected on how much I'd learned about both Derek and myself during the past month. The man I'd been married to for 12 years had revealed himself to be capable of sophisticated criminal behavior targeting his own mother, driven by greed and a callous disregard for family relationships that I'd never previously suspected. At the same time, I'd discovered that I possessed skills and strengths that I'd never fully utilized in my personal life. The analytical abilities that made me successful in my professional auditing work translated perfectly to criminal investigation, and the emotional resilience I'd developed during the months of dealing with Derek's affair had prepared me to handle the stress and complexity of building a legal case. The upcoming confrontation would test everything I'd learned and determine whether my weeks of careful investigation would result in justice for Maggie and accountability for those who had tried to exploit her vulnerability. I was as ready as I could be for whatever would happen next, armed with evidence, legal knowledge, and a determination to protect someone who had become like a mother to me. The investigation phase of Operation Maggie was complete. Now it was time to spring the trap. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that makes Portland residents remember why they love living in the Pacific Northwest, but I barely noticed the golden leaves or clear skies as I drove towards Sunset Manor. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my breathing controlled, and my mind focused on the task ahead. In my purse, a small digital recorder was already running, and my phone was set to automatically back up any photos or videos to a secure cloud storage account. After weeks of careful preparation, the moment of confrontation had finally arrived. I arrived at Maggie's apartment 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting, giving me time to position myself strategically and ensure that my recording equipment was functioning properly. Maggie greeted me with her usual warmth, though I could see concern in her eyes about the upcoming discussion. She'd been increasingly uncomfortable with the care arrangements that had been imposed upon her, and I could tell she was hoping this family meeting would provide some clarity about her situation. "Caroline, dear, I'm so glad you suggested this meeting," she said as she poured coffee into her favorite china cups. "I've been feeling quite overwhelmed by all these new arrangements, and I'd appreciate having someone advocate for my preferences." Her use of the word advocate struck me as particularly significant. Despite Derek and Vanessa's attempts to portray her as confused and dependent, Maggie clearly understood that she needed support in navigating the complex situation that had been created around her. She recognized that the care arrangements weren't truly in her best interest, and was looking to me for help in addressing the problem. I spent the next 20 minutes helping Maggie organize her thoughts about what she wanted to discuss during the meeting. She had prepared a list of concerns about Vanessa's presence in her apartment, including instances where medications had been moved without her permission, financial paperwork had been reviewed without her request, and decisions about her daily routine had been made without her input. Her list was detailed and specific, demonstrating the clear thinking and attention to detail that contradicted any claims about cognitive decline. At exactly 10 o'clock, Derek arrived with Vanessa and another man I didn't recognize. Derek's demeanor was more formal than usual, and he carried a leather briefcase that suggested this meeting was more business-oriented than the family discussion I'd proposed. Vanessa wore her professional scrubs and carried a folder of documents, while the unknown man was dressed in an expensive suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to conducting high-stakes negotiations. "Caroline, Mom, I'd like you to meet Robert Harrison," Derek said, gesturing toward the suited man. "He's an elder law attorney who specializes in care planning and asset protection. I thought it would be helpful to have professional guidance as we discuss Mom's future needs." The introduction of a lawyer immediately changed the dynamic of the meeting and confirmed my suspicions that this was not going to be a simple family discussion about care preferences. The presence of legal counsel suggested that Derek was planning to formalize some kind of arrangement that would require Maggie's signature, most likely the power of attorney document I'd been expecting. Robert Harrison greeted Maggie with the kind of professional warmth that attorneys use when they're trying to establish rapport with potential clients. However, I noticed that he directed most of his attention toward Derek rather than Maggie, which suggested that he viewed Derek as his actual client, despite the fact that any legal documents would need Maggie's consent. "Mrs. Walsh, your son has been telling me about his concerns regarding your ability to manage the increasing complexity of your care needs," Harrison said, settling into a chair across from Maggie. "He's asked me to explain some legal options that might help ensure your wishes are respected, while also providing him with the authority to act on your behalf when necessary." This opening statement was masterfully constructed to sound reasonable, while actually containing several problematic assumptions. Harrison had accepted Derek's characterization of Maggie's situation without independently assessing her capabilities, and he was framing the legal arrangements as being in Maggie's interest, while actually serving Derek's needs for increased control. Maggie responded with the kind of polite but firm clarity that I'd come to admire during our friendship. "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate Derek's concern, but I haven't noticed any increasing complexity in my care needs. I'm managing quite well with the support services provided by the facility, and I haven't requested additional assistance with legal or financial matters." Her response clearly established that she was not experiencing the problems that Derek had described to the attorney. This was crucial for my documentation purposes, as it demonstrated that any legal arrangements would be based on false premises rather than Maggie's actual needs or preferences. Derek immediately intervened with a concerned tone that I recognized as his manipulation voice, the same tone he'd used when lying to me about his affair. "Mom, you may not realize how much help you've been needing lately. Vanessa has been documenting some incidents that suggest you're having more difficulty with daily tasks than you might remember." Vanessa opened her folder and produced a typed report that she claimed documented instances of confusion, medication errors, and safety concerns during her visits. As she read from the report, I used my phone to photograph the pages, noting that the document was dated and signed as if it were an official medical assessment rather than simply a caregiver's observations. The report was a sophisticated piece of fiction, describing incidents that I knew had never occurred, and portraying Maggie as significantly more impaired than she actually was. The document was clearly designed to provide legal justification for the power of attorney arrangement, creating a paper trail that would support claims about Maggie's diminished capacity. "I don't recall any of these incidents," Maggie said firmly after Vanessa finished reading. "In fact, I keep detailed notes about my daily activities, and I can show you that I've been managing my medications and personal care without any problems." Maggie stood and retrieved a small notebook from her desk, handing it to me rather than to Derek or the attorney. The notebook contained daily entries documenting her medication schedule, meal times, social activities, and physical exercises. The entries were detailed, well-organized, and clearly written, providing strong evidence of cognitive competence and independent functioning. I made sure to photograph several pages of the notebook while pretending to review the contents. The contrast between Maggie's actual documentation of her daily life and Vanessa's fabricated report would be crucial evidence if this case ever went to court. Robert Harrison seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, as Maggie's clear thinking and detailed record-keeping undermined the narrative that Derek had apparently provided about her condition. He shifted tactics, focusing on the legal technicalities rather than Maggie's actual capabilities. "Mrs. Walsh, regardless of your current functioning level, it's always wise to have legal arrangements in place for potential future needs," he said, removing documents from his briefcase. "The power of attorney document I've prepared would allow Derek to act on your behalf only if you became unable to manage your affairs yourself. It's essentially an insurance policy that ensures your interests would be protected." This explanation was misleading in several important ways. A durable power of attorney, depending on how it was written, could potentially be activated immediately upon signing, rather than only in cases of incapacity. Additionally, the person holding power of attorney would have broad authority to make financial decisions without ongoing oversight or accountability to the principal. "May I review the document before Mrs. Walsh considers signing anything?" I asked, extending my hand toward Harrison. "I'd like to understand exactly what authority would be granted and under what circumstances it could be exercised." Harrison hesitated, glancing at Derek before reluctantly handing me the document. As I began reading, I immediately noticed several red flags that confirmed my worst suspicions about the true purpose of this legal arrangement. The power of attorney was written as an immediately effective document rather than a springing power that would only activate upon incapacity. This meant that Derek would gain complete control over Maggie's finances the moment she signed, regardless of her actual ability to manage her own affairs. The document also included unusually broad language that would allow Derek to sell property, change beneficiaries, and make gifts to himself, all without requiring Maggie's ongoing consent or knowledge. Most troubling was a clause that would allow Derek to place Maggie in a care facility against her will if he determined that she was no longer capable of independent living. This provision essentially gave him the power to institutionalize his mother based solely on his own assessment of her needs, without requiring medical evaluation or court approval. "This document grants extremely broad authority," I said, looking directly at Harrison. "It would allow Derek to control all of Mrs. Walsh's financial assets immediately upon signing, and it includes provisions that could override her preferences about where and how she lives." "Are you certain this level of authority is necessary for Mrs. Walsh's situation?" Harrison's discomfort was becoming increasingly obvious as I questioned the document's provisions. He'd apparently expected this to be a routine signing, where an elderly client would simply trust her family's recommendations without scrutinizing the legal details. "The document includes standard provisions for comprehensive care planning," he said defensively. "These authorities are necessary to ensure that Derek can act quickly if situations arise that require immediate decision-making." Maggie had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, and she finally spoke up with more firmness than I'd ever heard her use. "I don't want Derek to have that kind of control over my life and my property. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions, and if I ever need help, I can arrange for limited assistance that doesn't require giving up my independence." Her statement was clear, unambiguous, and delivered with the kind of decisiveness that demolished any claims about cognitive impairment or inability to understand complex decisions. The fact that she was rejecting the power of attorney arrangement after having its implications explained demonstrated exactly the kind of informed decision-making that the law was designed to protect. Derek's reaction to his mother's refusal was immediate and revealing. Instead of accepting her decision or trying to address her concerns, he became visibly agitated and began using the kind of pressure tactics that are characteristic of financial exploitation schemes. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this," he said, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. "Vanessa has documented multiple instances where you've made poor decisions or forgotten important things. You need to trust that we're trying to protect you from making mistakes that could put you at risk." This response was significant for several reasons. Derek was contradicting his mother's clearly expressed wishes based on disputed claims about her capabilities. He was using emotional manipulation to override her legal right to refuse unwanted legal arrangements. And he was creating a situation where her refusal to sign could be portrayed as evidence of the very impairment he was claiming to address. Vanessa joined the pressure campaign with her own version of concerned caregiving. "Mrs. Walsh, I understand that signing legal documents feels overwhelming, but Derek really does have your best interests at heart. As your caregiver, I've seen how much stress you experience when you have to manage complex decisions on your own." This statement was particularly problematic because it misrepresented Vanessa's role and qualifications. She was presenting herself as a medical professional whose observations carried special weight, when, in fact, she was an unqualified caregiver whose reports were biased by her personal relationship with Derek and her financial interest in the scheme. The pressure tactics continued for nearly an hour, with Derek, Vanessa, and Harrison taking turns trying to convince Maggie that signing the power of attorney was in her best interest. They used a combination of fear-mongering about potential future crises, false claims about her current functioning, and emotional manipulation about family relationships and trust. Throughout this process, I maintained careful documentation using both my hidden recorder and discrete photographs. I also asked strategic questions that helped establish key facts for the record, including clarification about Derek's actual authority to make healthcare decisions, confirmation of Maggie's right to refuse unwanted care arrangements, and specifics about the financial implications of the proposed legal documents. The turning point came when Derek finally lost his patience with his mother's continued refusal to sign the documents. His carefully maintained facade of concerned son cracked, revealing the anger and entitlement that had been driving his behavior throughout this scheme. "Mom, you're being ridiculous about this," he snapped, his voice harsh with frustration. "You can't keep pretending that you're capable of managing everything on your own. You need help whether you want to admit it or not, and if you won't accept it voluntarily, we'll have to find other ways to ensure you get the care you need." This statement was a clear threat, implying that Derek would take action against Maggie's will if she didn't comply with his demands. The threat was particularly significant because it revealed his willingness to override her legal rights and use coercive tactics to achieve his financial goals. Maggie's response was immediate and powerful. "Derek Walsh, I am your mother, and I deserve your respect, not your threats. I am competent to make my own decisions, and I do not consent to these legal arrangements or to continued care services from Ms. Brooks. I want all of you to leave my apartment immediately." Her statement was legally significant because it clearly established her refusal of consent for both the legal documents and the care services. It also demonstrated her ability to set boundaries and make definitive decisions under pressure, which contradicted every claim that had been made about her supposed incapacity. Derek's reaction to his mother's dismissal was to become even more aggressive, crossing the line from manipulation into outright intimidation. He stood up abruptly, towering over Maggie in her chair, and began raising his voice in a way that was clearly intended to frighten her into compliance. "You don't get to just dismiss this, Mom," he said, his face flushed with anger. "We're trying to help you, and you're being ungrateful and stubborn. If you won't cooperate with reasonable care arrangements, then maybe you're not as competent as you think you are." This escalation gave me the opening I'd been waiting for throughout the entire confrontation. Derek had finally revealed his true intentions and methods, demonstrating the coercive tactics that were at the heart of the elder abuse scheme. The time had come to drop my own facade and reveal what I'd discovered during weeks of investigation. "Actually, Derek, I think it's time we discussed what's really happening here," I said, standing up and positioning myself between him and Maggie. "Because this isn't about Maggie's care needs or her competency. This is about a sophisticated financial exploitation scheme that you and Vanessa have been operating for months." The silence that followed my statement was electric with tension. Derek's face went pale as he realized that his wife had not been the passive observer he'd assumed. While Vanessa and Harrison exchanged glances that suggested they were calculating their legal exposure and planning their exit strategies. "I have documentation of unauthorized withdrawals from Maggie's accounts, fabricated care reports, and connections between Derek and individuals with histories of fraudulent business activities," I continued, my voice steady and professional. "I also have recordings of this meeting that clearly demonstrate the use of threats and coercion to pressure an elderly woman into signing legal documents that would facilitate financial exploitation." Derek attempted to bluster his way through the confrontation, but his shock at being exposed had clearly rattled him. "Caroline, you don't know what you're talking about. Everything we've done has been for Mom's benefit, and if you've been spying on family activities, then maybe you're the one with the problem." His attempt to turn the situation around on me was predictable but ineffective. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, and I was ready with specific evidence that would be difficult for him to dismiss or explain away. "Would you like me to read the account numbers for the unauthorized withdrawals, Derek? Or perhaps we should discuss the payments to shell companies owned by your associate Marcus Reed. I have photographs of your meetings with him, along with business registration records showing his history of fraudulent enterprises." The specificity of my evidence clearly shocked Derek, who had assumed his activities were undetected and undocumented. He began to realize that his wife had been conducting a sophisticated investigation that had uncovered the full scope of his criminal activities. Robert Harrison, recognizing that he had been drawn into a potentially criminal scheme, began gathering his documents and preparing to leave. "I think there may be some misunderstandings here that need to be resolved privately within the family," he said diplomatically. "I'll be withdrawing from this matter pending clarification of the underlying facts." His hasty departure was an admission that the legal arrangements he'd been promoting were not legitimate care planning, but rather part of a scheme that he now recognized as potentially criminal. His withdrawal would leave Derek and Vanessa without the legal cover they'd been relying on to legitimize their activities. Vanessa, meanwhile, had been increasingly agitated throughout my revelations, and she finally made the mistake that would seal her fate. Instead of remaining silent or trying to minimize her involvement, she decided to go on the offensive with a series of statements that clearly demonstrated her knowledge of and participation in the scheme. "You can't prove any of this," she said angrily. "Mrs. Walsh really does need help, and we've been providing legitimate care services. If money has been spent, it's been for her benefit, and she consented to all the care arrangements." This response was legally devastating for several reasons. Vanessa had implicitly acknowledged that money had been taken from Maggie's accounts. She had claimed that Maggie had consented to arrangements that we'd just witnessed her clearly refuse. And she had attempted to justify the financial transactions as legitimate expenses rather than denying that they had occurred. The confrontation concluded with me informing Derek and Vanessa that I would be contacting law enforcement and adult protective services to report the elder abuse scheme. I also informed them that I had sufficient evidence to support both criminal charges and civil recovery actions, and that their best option would be to cooperate fully with the coming investigations. As they left Maggie's apartment in obvious distress and confusion, I realized that the strategic confrontation had accomplished everything I'd hoped to achieve. I'd documented their criminal activities in real time, established Maggie's competency and refusal of consent, and gathered the admissions and statements that would be crucial for successful prosecution. The investigation phase of Operation Maggie was complete, and the evidence gathering had exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Now it was time to hand the case over to the authorities and ensure that justice would be served for the attempted exploitation of a vulnerable elderly woman. The Multnomah County Sheriff's Office detective, who answered my call 45 minutes after the confrontation at Maggie's apartment, was a woman named Detective Janet Morrison, whose calm professionalism immediately put me at ease, despite the chaotic emotions I was experiencing. She arrived at Sunset Manor within an hour of my initial report, accompanied by a specialist from Adult Protective Services named Thomas Chen, whose expertise in financial crimes against elderly victims would prove invaluable in the coming weeks. Detective Morrison began by interviewing Maggie separately, ensuring that she could provide her account of events without any potential influence from family members. What impressed me most about Morrison's approach was her obvious experience with elder abuse cases and her understanding of the complex dynamics that often prevent victims from reporting financial exploitation by family members. She asked careful questions that allowed Maggie to describe her experiences in her own words, while also gathering specific information that would be needed for criminal charges. Maggie's statement was clear and detailed, describing how Derek had arranged for Vanessa's care services without her consent, how Vanessa had pressured her to provide financial information and sign documents she didn't understand, and how both Derek and Vanessa had made false claims about her mental capacity in order to justify their increased involvement in her personal affairs. Most importantly, Maggie explicitly stated that she had never authorized anyone to access her bank accounts or make financial decisions on her behalf. Thomas Chen conducted a parallel interview focused on the financial aspects of the case, reviewing the bank records and transaction histories that I'd discovered during my investigation. His analysis confirmed that the pattern of withdrawals and payments constituted a textbook case of financial exploitation, with the perpetrators using their access to Maggie's home and personal information to systematically drain her accounts while creating a paper trail that would be difficult for the victim to detect or understand. The evidence I'd gathered during my weeks of investigation proved to be exactly what law enforcement needed to build a strong criminal case. The financial records demonstrated clear patterns of unauthorized transactions. The recordings from the confrontation provided evidence of coercion and false statements, and the documentation of Maggie's actual cognitive functioning contradicted the claims that had been used to justify the exploitation scheme. Detective Morrison explained that elder financial abuse cases often failed to result in prosecution because victims were unable or unwilling to cooperate with investigations. Evidence was difficult to gather after the fact, and family relationships complicated the legal proceedings. In this case, however, the comprehensive documentation I'd assembled and Maggie's clear willingness to pursue charges created an unusually strong foundation for criminal prosecution. Within 24 hours of my initial report, warrants had been issued for Derek and Vanessa's arrest on charges including theft, fraud, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and conspiracy. The speed of law enforcement's response reflected both the quality of evidence I'd provided and their recognition that financial crimes against elderly victims often escalate quickly once the perpetrators realize they've been discovered. Derek was arrested at his office at Northwest Financial Consulting Group on Wednesday morning, creating a scene that immediately became the subject of workplace gossip and professional speculation. His employer placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of criminal proceedings, effectively ending his career in financial services regardless of whether he was ultimately convicted of the charges against him. Vanessa was arrested at the fitness center where she still worked part-time, having apparently assumed that her nursing assistant certification and connection to Derek would protect her from serious consequences. Her arrest was particularly satisfying to me because it demonstrated that she couldn't simply claim to be a naive accomplice who had been manipulated by Derek into participating in illegal activities. The arrest of Marcus Reed, the owner of Pacific Northwest Home Care Services, required more complex investigation by law enforcement, but the financial records I'd discovered led detectives to uncover a sophisticated network of shell companies and fraudulent business operations that had been targeting elderly victims throughout the Portland metropolitan area. Reed's operation had apparently been using the home care industry as a cover for systematic financial exploitation, with Derek and Vanessa representing just one team in a larger criminal enterprise. The involvement of multiple agencies in investigating the case created a level of scrutiny and resources that far exceeded what I'd expected when I first reported the crimes. The Oregon Department of Justice assigned a prosecutor who specialized in elder abuse cases, The state insurance commissioner began investigating Pacific Northwest Home Care Services and related businesses, and the FBI opened a parallel investigation into potential mail and wire fraud violations that could result in federal charges. Robert Harrison, the attorney who had prepared the fraudulent power of attorney documents, became the subject of a disciplinary investigation by the Oregon State Bar. While he claimed that he'd been deceived by Derek about Maggie's condition and needs, the evidence suggested that he'd failed to conduct the independent assessment of his client's capacity that ethical rules required before preparing such extensive legal documents. His law license was suspended, pending the outcome of the criminal case and related disciplinary proceedings. He'd been tracking your every movement for months, probably planning to use the information to establish alibis for your murder. The level of surveillance Derek had maintained was disturbing beyond the attempted poisoning. He'd turned our home into a prison where my every action was monitored and recorded, creating a digital cage that would have made escaping his murder plot nearly impossible under normal circumstances. Dr. Kim returned with final test results showing that the antidotes had successfully neutralized Dr. Torres's chemical cocktail, but the damage to my liver and kidneys would require ongoing monitoring for potential long-term effects. Derek's systematic poisoning campaign had left permanent traces in my body, a physical reminder of his sustained attempt to kill me. The good news is that your cognitive function appears completely unaffected, Dr. Kim reported, reviewing neurological test results. Whatever Derek was using to cause confusion and disorientation was temporary and hasn't caused lasting brain damage. The medical clearance meant I could be discharged from the hospital and begin participating more actively in the federal prosecution. Agent Rodriguez had arranged for protective custody at a secure location while Derek awaited trial, ensuring that any remaining members of his criminal network couldn't target me for retaliation. As evening approached, my hospital room filled with law enforcement officials, victim advocates, and legal professionals, coordinating the massive prosecution effort that had grown from my initial report of suspicious poisoning. The case had become a federal priority, with resources being allocated to ensure comprehensive investigation and successful conviction of everyone involved. Agent Rodriguez's final briefing of the day brought news that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. The federal grand jury had returned indictments against Derek, Patricia, Dr. Torres, and Kevin Walsh on charges that could result in life sentences without possibility of parole. Tomorrow morning we'll be announcing the largest elder fraud prosecution in federal history, Agent Rodriguez concluded, closing her laptop after hours of evidence review. Your courage in documenting Derek's crimes while he was trying to kill you has saved countless lives and exposed a criminal enterprise that was destroying families across multiple states. The scheme targeting Maggie had apparently been part of a larger pattern of financial crimes that had victimized multiple elderly clients who trusted him with their retirement savings. The discovery of Derek's professional embezzlement added federal charges to the case and increased the potential prison sentences he faced, if convicted, on all counts. It also created additional victims who joined Maggie in seeking restitution for their losses, turning the case into a major financial fraud prosecution that attracted attention from law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Vanessa's attempts to minimize her role in the scheme by claiming she'd been manipulated by Derek proved unsuccessful when investigators discovered evidence that she'd been involved in similar activities with previous employers. Her background check revealed that she'd left 2 previous healthcare positions under suspicious circumstances involving missing medications and unauthorized access to patient information. The pattern suggested that her relationship with Derek had been opportunistic rather than romantic, with both parties seeking to exploit his access to elderly victims and her credentials as a healthcare worker. The investigation into Pacific Northwest Home Care Services revealed the true sophistication of the criminal enterprise that Derek and Vanessa had been part of. Marcus Reed had created a network of shell companies and fake healthcare businesses that provided cover for systematic financial exploitation of elderly victims throughout Oregon and Washington. The operation had generated more than $2 million in fraudulent revenue over 3 years, making it one of the largest elder abuse schemes ever prosecuted in the Pacific Northwest. Reed's business model had involved recruiting accomplices like Derek, who had legitimate access to elderly victims through family relationships or professional connections, then providing them with fake healthcare credentials and legal documents that created the appearance of legitimate care services. The scheme had been particularly effective because it exploited the natural concerns that adult children have about aging parents, while taking advantage of the complex and poorly regulated home care industry. The federal investigation revealed that Reed had been operating similar schemes in multiple states, using different business names and recruited accomplices to avoid detection by law enforcement. His arrest led to the discovery of more than 100 additional victims who had lost money to fraudulent care services, creating a massive case that required coordination between multiple jurisdictions and federal agencies. As the criminal cases moved through the court system, I found myself dealing with the personal aftermath of Derek's arrest and the dissolution of our marriage. The house we'd shared in Laurelhurst was seized as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings related to his embezzlement charges, requiring me to find new housing while also serving as a witness in multiple criminal cases. The emotional support I received from Maggie during this difficult period was both touching and ironic. The woman I'd set out to protect from financial exploitation became my strongest supporter as I dealt with the consequences of exposing my own husband's criminal activities. She insisted that I move into the guest room at her apartment temporarily, providing me with both housing and companionship during the most challenging months of the legal proceedings. The civil litigation that followed the criminal charges created additional opportunities for recovery, but also extended the legal process for more than a year. Maggie filed suit against Derek, Vanessa, Pacific Northwest Home Care Services, and Robert Harrison, seeking both compensatory and punitive damages for the attempted financial exploitation. Similar lawsuits were filed by other victims of the scheme, creating a complex web of civil proceedings that paralleled the criminal cases. The insurance coverage that was supposed to protect victims of healthcare fraud proved to be inadequate in many cases, as the fraudulent nature of Pacific Northwest Home Care Services meant that legitimate insurance policies didn't apply to losses caused by their activities. This gap in coverage became a significant issue for victims who had lost substantial amounts of money and were depending on restitution orders that might never be fully collectible. The prosecution of Derek and Vanessa proceeded more quickly than the related cases against Reed and his associates, as their crimes were more straightforward, and the evidence I'd gathered provided a clear foundation for conviction. Both defendants initially pleaded not guilty and attempted to mount defenses based on claims that they'd been providing legitimate care services and that any financial irregularities were the result of misunderstandings rather than criminal intent. The strength of the evidence against them became apparent during pretrial proceedings, when their defense attorneys were provided with copies of the recordings I'd made during the confrontation at Maggie's apartment. The audio clearly captured Derek and Vanessa making false statements about Maggie's condition, using coercive tactics to pressure her into signing legal documents, and acknowledging their involvement in financial transactions that they couldn't adequately explain. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against them, Derek eventually agreed to plead guilty to theft and exploitation charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and his cooperation in the prosecution of Reed and the broader criminal enterprise. His plea agreement required him to provide complete information about his involvement in the scheme and testify against his co-conspirators if necessary. Vanessa initially attempted to maintain her innocence, claiming that she'd been deceived by Derek about the legitimacy of their activities, and that she genuinely believed she was providing needed care services to elderly clients. However, the discovery of her previous suspicious employment history and evidence of her active participation in creating fraudulent care reports ultimately convinced her to accept a plea agreement similar to Derek's. The sentencing phase of the criminal proceedings provided an opportunity for victims to describe the impact of the crimes on their lives and their families. Maggie's victim impact statement was particularly powerful, describing not only the financial harm she'd suffered, but also the emotional trauma of being betrayed by her own son and manipulated by people she'd trusted to provide care. Derek received a sentence of 4 years in state prison plus restitution orders totaling more than $600,000, reflecting both his theft from Maggie and his embezzlement from clients at Northwest Financial Consulting Group. The sentence was longer than typical for first-time financial crimes because of the vulnerability of his victims and his abuse of positions of trust as both a son and a financial advisor. Vanessa received a sentence of 2 years in prison plus substantial restitution orders, with her sentence being somewhat shorter than Derek's due to her cooperation with law enforcement and her secondary role in the overall scheme. However, her nursing assistant certification was permanently revoked, and she was prohibited from working in healthcare or eldercare industries in the future. The broader investigation of Reed's criminal enterprise continued for more than a year after Derek and Vanessa's sentencing, ultimately resulting in federal charges against more than a dozen defendants, and the recovery of several $1 million in assets that were used to provide restitution to victims. The case became a model for how law enforcement agencies could effectively investigate and prosecute complex elder abuse schemes that crossed state lines and involved multiple criminal organizations. The systemic changes that resulted from the investigation included enhanced oversight of home care agencies, stronger background check requirements for healthcare workers, and improved coordination between adult protective services and law enforcement agencies in investigating financial crimes against elderly victims. The case also led to legislative changes that increased penalties for elder abuse and provided additional resources for victims seeking to recover losses from financial exploitation. The response of the legal system to the evidence I'd gathered exceeded my most optimistic expectations when I first decided to investigate Derek and Vanessa's activities. The comprehensive prosecution of the scheme and the broader criminal enterprise it was part of demonstrated that law enforcement agencies could effectively respond to elder abuse when provided with proper evidence and victim cooperation. The case also showed that individual citizens could play a crucial role in protecting vulnerable community members by recognizing signs of exploitation and taking appropriate action to document and report suspicious activities. 2 years after the confrontation that exposed Derek and Vanessa's elder abuse scheme, I stood in the conference room of my newly established practice, Elder Justice Advocates, reviewing files for 3 new cases that had been referred to me by Adult Protective Services. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows of our downtown Portland office illuminated documents that told familiar stories of financial exploitation, family betrayal, and elderly victims who needed someone willing to fight for their rights and dignity. The transformation from betrayed wife to advocate for vulnerable seniors had been neither planned nor easy, but it had given my life a purpose and meaning that I'd never experienced during my years as a corporate auditor. The skills that had made me effective at tracking financial irregularities in nonprofit organizations translated perfectly to investigating elder abuse, while the personal experience of discovering and exposing Derek's crimes had taught me how to navigate the complex emotional dynamics that surrounded these cases. Maggie Walsh, now 80 years old and still living independently at Sunset Manor, had become not just my closest friend but also my unofficial mentor in understanding the perspectives and needs of elderly crime victims. Her resilience in recovering from the trauma of her son's betrayal had inspired me to channel my own anger and pain into constructive action that could help others facing similar situations. The restitution process from Derek's criminal conviction had been lengthy and complicated, but Maggie had ultimately recovered most of the money that had been stolen from her accounts. More importantly, the experience had empowered her to become an advocate for other elderly victims, speaking at conferences and community meetings about the warning signs of financial exploitation and the importance of maintaining independence despite family pressure. Derek had been released from prison after serving 3 years of his 4-year sentence, but his attempts to rebuild his life had been largely unsuccessful. His felony convictions had permanently barred him from working in financial services, and the publicity surrounding his case had made it difficult for him to find employment in any field requiring trust or responsibility. He'd moved to another state after his release, apparently seeking to escape the notoriety that followed him in Portland. Our divorce had been finalized while he was still in prison, with the division of assets simplified by the fact that most of our marital property had been seized during the criminal proceedings. The house in Laurelhurst had been sold to provide restitution to victims, leaving me with few financial resources but also free from the emotional burden of maintaining connections to our failed marriage. Vanessa had served her full 2-year sentence and had also left Oregon after her release, but her attempts to find work in healthcare had been hampered by her criminal record and the revocation of her nursing credentials. The last information I'd received suggested that she was working in retail and living with family members who were helping her rebuild her life, though she would never again have access to vulnerable populations through professional caregiving roles. Marcus Reed and his criminal enterprise had faced more severe consequences. with Reed himself receiving a 12-year federal sentence for operating what prosecutors described as the largest elder abuse scheme in Pacific Northwest history. The investigation had ultimately identified more than 200 victims across multiple states, with total losses exceeding $4 million. Many of Reed's accomplices had also received substantial prison sentences, effectively dismantling the network that had preyed on elderly victims for years. The civil litigation arising from the criminal cases had continued for more than 3 years, with multiple insurance companies, healthcare agencies, and professional organizations facing liability for their roles in enabling the fraudulent activities. The settlements and judgments from these cases had provided additional restitution to victims, while also creating financial incentives for better oversight and prevention measures in the elder care industry. My decision to establish elder justice advocates had grown out of my experiences serving as a witness and advocate during the prosecutions and civil proceedings. I discovered that many elderly victims of financial crimes lacked access to legal representation that was both affordable and knowledgeable about the specific issues surrounding elder abuse. Traditional legal services were often too expensive for seniors on fixed incomes, while legal aid organizations were overwhelmed with cases and lacked the specialized expertise needed for complex financial crimes. Elder justice advocates operated as a hybrid organization, combining traditional legal services with investigative capabilities and victim advocacy. We accepted cases on a sliding fee scale based on clients' ability to pay, with costs often covered by restitution orders or contingency arrangements that made legal representation accessible to victims regardless of their financial resources. The investigative component of our services had proven particularly valuable in elder abuse cases, where the financial and emotional manipulation often made it difficult for victims to understand the scope of crimes committed against them. Our team included former law enforcement officers, forensic accountants, and social workers who could work together to document abuse patterns and build cases that would be successful in both criminal and civil proceedings. Dr. Patricia Reeves had become one of our most valuable professional allies, providing medical assessments that helped establish victims' cognitive competency and contradict false claims about mental decline that were often used to justify financial exploitation. Her willingness to testify about the medical aspects of elder abuse cases had been crucial in several successful prosecutions, where family members had claimed their victims were too impaired to provide reliable testimony. The technology tools that I'd learned to use during my investigation of Derek and Vanessa had evolved into sophisticated systems for documenting and analyzing financial crimes against elderly victims. We used specialized software to track complex financial transactions, identify patterns of exploitation, and create visual presentations that help juries understand the scope and impact of financial crimes that might otherwise seem too technical to comprehend. One of our most successful recent cases involved a situation remarkably similar to what Maggie had experienced, where an elderly woman's nephew had arranged for his girlfriend to become certified as a home health aide, specifically to gain access to his aunt's finances. The investigative techniques I'd developed during my own case allowed us to document the scheme before significant financial damage occurred, resulting in criminal convictions and full restitution for the victim. Another case involved a more complex scheme where multiple family members had collaborated with professional caregivers to systematically drain an elderly man's retirement accounts over several years. The financial analysis required to trace the stolen funds through multiple accounts and shell companies was exactly the kind of detailed investigative work that had become my specialty, and the successful prosecution had recovered more than $200,000 for the victim's estate. The educational component of elder justice advocates had grown into a comprehensive program that provided training for healthcare workers, financial institutions, and law enforcement officers about recognizing and responding to elder abuse. We developed workshops specifically designed for elderly individuals and their families about protecting assets and maintaining independence, while accepting appropriate assistance with daily living needs. Maggie had become one of our most effective speakers at these educational events, sharing her story with audiences throughout Oregon and neighboring states. Her ability to describe the subtle manipulation tactics that had been used against her, combined with her obvious intelligence and competence, helped other elderly individuals recognize similar warning signs in their own situations. The policy advocacy work that had emerged from our cases had contributed to significant legislative changes at both state and federal levels. We'd worked with lawmakers to strengthen penalties for elder abuse, improve oversight of home care agencies, and create better protections for elderly victims who came forward to report financial crimes. These systemic changes would help protect future generations of elderly Americans from the kinds of sophisticated exploitation schemes that were becoming increasingly common. The personal growth that had resulted from my transformation from victim to advocate had been as important as the professional success of elder justice advocates. The experience of discovering and exposing Derek's betrayal had taught me that I was capable of much more than I'd previously imagined, both in terms of investigative skills and emotional resilience. The work of helping other elderly victims had provided a sense of purpose that was far more fulfilling than my previous corporate career had ever been. The relationship between Maggie and me had evolved into something that resembled a mother-daughter bond, filling emotional needs for both of us that had been created by Derek's betrayal of our family relationships. She'd become the grandmother figure to my children that they'd lost when Derek's crimes destroyed our extended family connections, while I'd become the advocate and protector that she'd needed when her own son had chosen greed over love. The financial independence that I'd achieved through elder justice advocates had been hard-won but deeply satisfying. The organization was now self-sustaining through a combination of fee-for-service work, grants from foundations interested in elder rights, and contingency arrangements that allowed us to recover costs from successful cases. This financial model ensured that we could continue providing services to victims regardless of their ability to pay, while also maintaining the professional standards necessary for effective legal representation. The recognition that elder justice advocates had received from professional organizations and government agencies had exceeded my expectations when I first decided to leave corporate auditing to focus on elder abuse cases. We'd received awards from the Oregon State Bar, the National Association of Adult Protective Services Administrators, and the American Society on Aging for our innovative approaches to investigating and prosecuting financial crimes against elderly victims. The media attention that had followed our most successful cases had helped raise public awareness about elder abuse, while also generating referrals from families who recognized similar patterns in their own situations. Television interviews and newspaper articles about our work had contributed to a broader understanding of how sophisticated these crimes had become and what resources were available to help victims seek justice and recovery. The network of professional relationships that had developed through our work had created opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing that benefited elderly victims throughout the region. We regularly worked with law enforcement agencies, adult protective services, healthcare providers, and other legal professionals to coordinate responses to complex cases that required multiple types of expertise and intervention. Looking back on the journey that had begun with my discovery of Vanessa Brooks in Maggie's apartment, I realized that Derek's betrayal had ultimately led to something far more valuable than the marriage I'd lost. The work of protecting vulnerable elderly individuals from financial exploitation had given me a sense of purpose and accomplishment that no corporate job could have provided, while the relationships I'd built with clients like Maggie had created a chosen family that was stronger and more meaningful than the biological family that had been destroyed by greed and deception. The future of elder justice advocates looked bright, with plans to expand our services to other communities throughout the Pacific Northwest and possibly develop a national model that could be replicated by advocates in other states. The growing awareness of elder abuse as a serious social problem had created demand for specialized legal services that combined investigative capabilities with traditional advocacy, making our approach both needed and sustainable. As I prepared for another day of fighting for elderly victims who deserved dignity, respect, and protection in their golden years, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that shocking Tuesday morning when I'd first realized the scope of Derek and Vanessa's scheme. The pain of betrayal had been transformed into purpose, the skills of financial auditing had been redirected toward justice, and the experience of being victimized had been channeled into preventing others from suffering similar harm. Maggie often reminded me that strength could emerge from suffering, wisdom could grow from betrayal, and purpose could be found in the most unexpected circumstances. The elder abuse scheme that had threatened to destroy her independence and security had instead become the catalyst for a movement that was protecting countless other elderly individuals from similar exploitation. The work was far from finished, as new schemes and more sophisticated criminals continued to target elderly victims throughout the country. But the foundation had been laid for effective responses, the tools had been developed for successful investigations, and the precedents had been established for meaningful prosecutions. Each case we handled added to the body of knowledge about how to recognize, document, and prosecute elder abuse, while each successful outcome demonstrated that justice was possible even in the most complex and emotionally challenging situations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.